It feels like everything is absurdly expensive these days. So, how does it actually compare to the last 100 years? Has our cost of living actually risen far above our income? I keep seeing videos of people comparing how expensive something was in the past, a home, a car, even just a toaster, but they throw out these random numbers for what that means. You could buy a good house in 1940 for $3,000, which is like $70,000 today. Okay, but where does that math come from? And is it actually accurate at all? Well, like most things I talk about here, no, it's not accurate. At least not in the way it's being used. It's terribly unhelpful, in fact. And to answer the question about our modern cost of living, we're going to have to go way deeper than just a calculator. Well, deeper than this calculator, at least. This is the CPI inflation calculator, and it's what everyone uses for that back in the day math. CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. It takes the change in price of dozens of things to come up with a constantly fluctuating total of change, which is at its core inflation. Started up in 1913, the US government started tracking everyday purchases in every state. The list mostly covers food, but also includes power, gas, for example. Think of it as consumables, things you have to keep purchasing and can't just put off, like a new car. In some ways, it is the bare survival list. By tracking enough things, we come up with a general CPI shift that isn't affected by weird blips like the price of eggs last year. If you go to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics website, you can find tons of records going back to 1980-ish of month to month what all of this list cost. Records do go back much further, but aren't on those current charts. I dug up a few of those books to give us a more complete look at the overall changes. Granted, I only did this for 9 things because I am not that insane. If you only look at post 1975, though, most of the graphs are fairly steady in climb. That's really when the shift happened, however, as everything leading up to that point was rising at a completely different speed. But like I said, this number alone isn't actually that helpful. Why? Because it's only purchasing power, not earning power, not purchasing power of anything beyond this list at that. Nowhere does it include how income has changed, nor does it include how our budgets have changed. In 1920, only people that earned over 2,000 a year were taxed. That was less than 10% of the population. They also had completely different purchases and bills. We pay for insurance, electricity, water, cell phone, internet, cars, and so much more that wasn't on their list in the same way, or at all. Which means that calculator will give us wildly different answers. While a good new house in 1920, costing around $2,000, would show up as 34,000 in today's money, using that calculator, a dozen eggs, costing 60 cents back then, would show up as $10 today. Household income of 1,000 back then, a very middling amount, would be only 17,000 today, which looks like they would have struggled to purchase things like groceries and fuel, but could have easily bought a house. And that sounds crazy, for good reason. So let's take a different approach and wade into the research to find the numbers. Something I enjoy doing for history, but really hate doing for my regular life. If you've ever had to go looking for a new doctor, you understand what I mean. That's why I'm so happy that the sponsor for today's video is ZocDoc. This is the fourth major move I've made as an adult, and every time the sheer number of things I have to start over is overwhelming. Finding a new coffee shop is one thing, but a new doctor has to be the worst. Searching through name after name, digging up reviews, figuring out who takes my insurance, and all to find months long waiting lists if they're even taking new patients. Sure, it's something I should do as soon as I move, but so often it's put to the side until I have health issues that can't wait that long, because the hundreds of boxes to unpack are in the way right now. That's where ZocDoc comes in. They let you easily search through 150,000 providers who are local and in network, which includes all sorts from dentists to primary care to psychiatrists. The reviews are right there, so you can find an option that works for your needs. And even better, they show you a list of available appointments and you can instantly book. No phone calls or leaving voicemails or hoping for a response. Just a straightforward system that lays everything out and means you can prioritize based on what you need right now. And it's free to use. They have over 200 specialties, so you can find a doctor who can specifically help you. At ZocDoc, you can book your appointment and see a doctor fast, usually within 24 to 72 hours, sometimes even the same day. I keep putting off going to the dentist, but there's only a few clicks to find an option next week, so no more excuses. Any medical process can be extremely stressful, and it shouldn't need to start before you even make the appointment. I know so many of you are in this exact predicament, putting it off because you've been busy, stressed, or don't even know where to start. I've absolutely been there, and we both know we shouldn't keep waiting until something goes wrong before we finally deal with it. You deserve to have someone in your corner before the crisis hits. Taking care of your health just got easier. Head to ZocDoc.com/Nicole Rudolph to get started and check that appointment off your to-do list. Thanks to ZocDoc for sponsoring today's video and helping us all take better care of our health. First up, income. Something that is annoyingly hard to track until the 1970s. Remember that whole "we didn't tax most people back then" thing? Well, that's where we get a lot of that income information from every year, our taxes. Prior to that, we had census records every 10 years and surveys here or there. So there are some spotty numbers earlier in the 20th century, but it's not nearly as detailed. Note that this is also where the word median is going to start coming up a lot. Just to point it out and really clarify, I am not using averages. That's taking all of the numbers, smushing them together, and cutting parts equally. One massive outlier can mess everything up. Median looks at where 50% of examples are above and 50% are below, so that outlier or even a few outliers in a large sample don't matter. It's essentially common, regular, or whatever word you want to impart there. To add more complication to income, there's three different records of it, not including measuring minimum wage, which started in 1939. Individual, household, and family. The last two get mixed up easily. Family is essentially measuring only those that are in a family unit, so it doesn't include singles or households with multiple incomes if they aren't related, married, etc. It technically should be higher than all the others because of that. It's not useful for what we're looking at so much as useful to see the differences between how families versus individuals, even in a shared space, are doing. Really, all we're trying to see here are any notable trends. Things like after 1970, the household income diverges from single as more and more households become two income with women in the workplace as well. Add minimum wage to that, and you can also see the absolute plateau since the last raise, a stark comparison to income growth. The next question to answer is how budgets have changed. What we need to spend money on is not consistent. So to assume we have the same percentage of income to spend on food or housing as they did 100 years ago is a problem. I've actually covered this in way more detail in a previous video, along with a discussion about how clothing has been affected by inflation and budget. So that's where a lot of this data comes from if you want to see additional source discussions. The quick version is that there are tons of books and pamphlets out there on how to budget a household throughout the 20th century. They're always aimed at people who are the middling sort, right in that median income range. People who have enough money to be able to decide a good budget, thus not being absolutely paycheck to paycheck in order to eat at all, but also not wealthy enough to not really need to have a budget. To start, let's look at a modern recommendation, an amalgamation of a few, all fairly similar. Remember that this is after taxes. So we're not including that 25% or so that median income loses before we get to the budget. They show 30% going to housing, 20% to insurance and savings, 20% to general expenses, 13% to food, 10% to betterment, things like classes, exercise, reading, and 7% to clothing. So if we look at a median income of around 82,000, take home after taxes is predicted to be around 62,000. That would be divided up monthly to make it easier, just under $5,200 take home for 1560 for housing, 1040 insurance and savings, 1040 to general expenses, 676 to food, 520 to betterment, and 364 to clothing. If we look at what was recommended in the first half of the 20th century, along with 1 to 5% taxes, it's dramatically more spent on food and clothing, less on housing, expenses, and insurance. Only betterment stays similar. To apply that budget to the modern income, it'd be 6,500 take home a month, 1,000 on housing, more than 2,200 on food, almost 1,000 on clothing, 750 on expenses, about 900 on betterment, and 650 on insurance and savings. That's an intense difference on budget. So we can already see why that inflation calculator doesn't mean much the further back we go. The cost of a loaf of bread could be way more before it's a problem if we had $2,200 a month to spend on food instead of 676. So let's keep building on that. With buildings, how much did a house cost or rent? Not shockingly, again, we've kept terribly inconsistent records. Some of the earlier methods, 1940 on, were to ask about house value on the census. Unless you just bought your house, that's kind of a guess by the homeowner, because we do actually measure house sales separately today. And then there's records of how much houses are valued at for taxes or insurance, all of which are slightly different, as well as new house sales. Add in that until the 1930s, mortgages were more like 3 years long. So, assuming that much budget per year on housing was more focused on other household needs because they assumed most people weren't in the process of continuing to pay out a mortgage. They were either done with that or renting and saving up for a down payment. So let's just stick to 1940 onwards to keep it cleaner. The census put median house value around $3,000 that year and rent at $27 a month, which would be $324 a year. Using those same proportions of income to housing costs today would be a house value of $120,000 and rent at around $1,080 a month. Still reminding they had a much different budget. Actual numbers for today, though, are $423,000 for the house and over $1,500 a month for rent. Let's find a middle example. 1970. Household income at that time was around $8,730. House sales $23,900 and rent at about $100 a month. Apply those proportions to today to get a house around 220,000 and rent at 916. So houses today are about double the value in 1970 and rent is about 1.5 times higher. Spread this out to all of the decades and you can see the shifts that start up after 1970. That's also as taxes get closer to what we're used to. So yes, rent is a decent amount higher than it was for most of the 20th century, and houses are a lot higher. Interest rate does have an effect on the monthly payments, obviously, and around 1980, we peaked briefly around 18%. That was mostly the 1979 to 83 range that got near that, and was more like 10% on either side of that. However, 1980 median of house sales was 63,700 and household income was 17,710. Down payments for repeat home buyers, not first time, which was a little bit lower, went up to more commonly around 30% to help offset. It was more like 25% in the 1970s, so just a little bit higher, which means slightly above median income for a down payment. But that group is second, third, or however many times home buyers, so most of that is probably coming out of their previous house sale. At the peak of interest rates, that would be $672 a month. Rent was more like $250. Again, proportion to income math would put that at just over $3,000 a month today. That doesn't include taxes or insurance. Either way, out of the range of a median income, admittedly. But our median mortgage payment right now is coming in around 2,000 to 2,500, not much lower. Oh, and the 1980 down payment of 30% would be just above their median income. Today, it would be more than 1.5 times median income. All to say that even at the very worst point in the 20th century, which lasted about 4 years, it's not way off from right now. And at no point has rent been this high previously. So saving up for a down payment right now is much harder. More importantly, that really high interest rate was done to help fight back the, at the time, extremely high inflation that was happening in the 1970s. When that leveled, the interest rates were brought back down, bringing back up that graph of inflation that calculates CPI to show you what the increase looked like in the 1970s compared to the last 5 years. But let's also take a look at the other parts of the pie chart of budget. After all, our housing chunk is much larger than the pre 1970s versions. Like I mentioned, clothing, I went over in great detail previously. So the sum of it is that while individual pieces of outerwear, dresses, suits, coats, etc., were on the higher side at the beginning of the century, they gradually came down comparative to income. That didn't mean that they had next to no clothing at certain points, just that they had a larger budget for it. 15 to 20% of their income instead of 7% after taxes. They also had better quality that lasted longer and bought a lot of layers so that their expensive outer clothing stayed clean and cared for while purchasing much cheaper undergarments. They also didn't throw them into tumble dry and wear them out. Also, not made from synthetics until the 1960s, and then honestly, at that point, that's where prices get wacky. New inventions cost a lot to start because of novelty and then drop down when production gets big enough, then slowly rise in the 21st century when we lose the knowledge of what quality is actually worth. Or at least that's the case with clothing. Not sure we could see the same evolution happen in other household goods. I went through Sears catalogs from 1910 to 1990, at which point they dramatically changed what they put into the catalogs. It's not really easy to follow after that. And then went to the website today to compare price evolutions for around 20 items. Why Sears catalog? Well, because it's definitely not aimed at rich people. It's just everyday populace with tons of examples, lots of different price ranges, and it still exists today. Not everything spans the entire range, as you'll see, but there's a story in every item about how prices change. I pulled a number from just below the median of all of the options. Essentially, if I were shopping in that year, how much money would it take for me to have at least a few good choices? Not to be able to buy the best, but also not be forced to buy the worst. Cars were the one thing that I looked at outside of the catalogs, just picking a low price four-door option from Ford starting in 1915. At that time, a Model T went for $490, about half a year's wages and half a decent house. The cost of a car actually fell for the rest of the 1920s as production smoothed out, but inevitably started the upward climb to keep up with both inflation and constantly updating technology. Up until the 1970s, cars keep at just below half the median household income, falling to around one third of that at that point. I admit, I am not a car history expert, but I guess this has something to do with the manufacturing overseas and or advancements in that tech. We're now sitting midway between those 2 points, one half and one third of income. Granted, the cost of a car is something many people will attempt to avoid when the economy is bad, so there's only so far that inflation can go without being tied to other elements like income. I didn't get into used cars because that is just messy. Other examples of tech have completely different stories. Televisions, for example, start off understandably expensive in the 1950 catalog, stay the same price in 1960, raise up with color options coming out in 1970. Black and white does get a little cheaper, but eventually start falling as we reach 1990. Similar things happen in the 21st century as new tech like flat screens starts expensive but becomes a fairly affordable option as the years go on and nothing else new really catches up, largely because, as with cars, people can hold on to the same one for a long time. And flat screen was the last truly massive upheaval that incentivized people to buy. Ironically, a 30-inch flat screen today costs about the same amount as those 1950s versions of around the same size. Not exactly an investment anymore. Radios follow a similar rise and fall of price, but essentially go defunct near 2000. It's hard to find a straight radio that doesn't have a clock, a cassette, or CD player, or even a tiny TV screen as of 1980. Quick aside to note just how much of a flashback this shopping trip through time was for me. Completely forgot about the tiny screen radios, which we used entirely for hunkering down during tornadoes in the basement by 1990. I'm sure others use them for sports, but not us. Alarm clocks, however, barely raise over the $2 price from the last few decades in 1950 to $3. Whoa. But make a slow climb until 1980 makes them digital and full of extras, like radios. I admit I do not miss waking up to whatever random song happened to be blaring as an alarm. That was our better option at the time. When it comes to playing music in general, the combination of products and constant updates to technology also feel like they should be following the same rise and fall pattern as TVs and radios, but they don't. It's almost like there's too many new options. Phonographs and talking machines lose their horns to become record players, then 8 tracks, followed by cassettes and CDs, and yes, there are plenty of other things that were short lived within that range. Add in the recording possibilities that seem to pop up just before each version dies off, and the weird combo players, which mean that there's not a major moment of new thing in the same way as other appliances. Not everyone wants to immediately swap over either, since acquiring all new tapes instead of records, or whatever the next format is way more expensive than just the player. And sometimes things die off entirely as a new option comes on the scene. Typewriters keep rising with inflation, but pretty much die out after 1980 because of the computer. There's actually a brief technology bridge of word processors, if you've ever wondered where that term comes from, that were basically a printer with keyboard and tiny screen. You could type and delete some of what you typed. That was it. You can see the drop off of the price for a moment before typewriters disappear, even with advertising them as having digital keys, so it's so much smoother and faster. Now, I don't have multiple entries for computers, just because of their age, but did want to show that the 1990 catalog was selling them for $1,500. A very expensive reason to have a bridge between them and typewriters. We've more than doubled our income median since then, so even the base computers, which did very little back then, would have cost as much as 2 MacBooks today. Other tech also didn't appear until well into the century. Camcorders, for $60 in 1970, rocketing up in price to $150 in 1980 and having barely any examples in the Sears catalog, for sale below $900 in 1990. Again, remember, Sears catalog is for very average people. That's why I'm using this as a basis. That's not because they didn't exist cheaper than that. It was just moving out of the Sears range of options, with digital and other technology progressing at fast speeds, and lots of companies deciding to sell in different places or out of their own stores or own catalogs. Those 1990s options in the catalog were not tiny family handhelds in the same way that they were in the 1980 catalog, with tiny little tapes to record on. Digital changed a lot of things very quickly. Cameras for photography have their own roller coaster of prices. Up in 1920 as popularity rose, dropped with progress, then back up in the 1950s, but slowly. I don't have the big digital leap recorded well here because of that gap, but as things like cell phones became smartphones, digital cameras were a blink in time, exempting professional stuff, obviously, just thinking of things you carry in your purse level. I purchased a digital camera when I was in college in the early 2000s, and that was a pretty decent investment. By the time I would have gotten around to getting another one to update that, the phone had one in it. So I didn't. Well, until I started doing this. Which, speaking of cell phones, everything I just mentioned is what gets wrapped up into our modern smartphones: radio, TV, typewriter, camcorder, camera, computer, music player, and more. A quantity of things that would easily add up to over $1,000 in 1970, for example, not adjusted to modern inflation. Just actually $1,000 in 1970, which is a lot of money. Just throw the Atari on top of that pile for good measure. Why not? Which is to say, if anyone ever tries to say we spend too much on our phones these days, it's just to replace all of that, which we definitely could not afford. Which, back in 1970, people weren't going out and buying all of those things at the same time for that same reason. But some things have not been replaced by cell phones or other items. So, what happened with their prices? The electric table lamp is probably the most boring. It only really has a small jump from 1970 to 1980 with inflation. I expected it to be a lot more to start, as electricity was still newish in the 1910 range, but it's not crazy expensive. That's not always the case, however. The washing machine was fascinating, mostly because it has major changes in what a washing machine even is. In 1910, it's just a crankable tub with a wringer, but in 1920, there are electric options that cause the price to go from $4 to $100. It gets cheaper until 1950, following that mass manufacture efficiency change that kind of expect. In 1960, however, another new style is introduced, and the price goes from $100 to $225. Then back down a bit in 1970 and upwards from there. Obviously, if we compare to modern prices for top load washers, it's nothing crazy, but front load was yet another jump in price more recently. The fridge, however, did not have quite as many ups and downs. A little jump from a $30 icebox in 1920 to a $150 electric top freezer in 1930, but pretty constantly uphill after a plateau through 1940. Again, if you switch to a side by side or eventually a French door, the price will go up way more. Vacuums were probably the most consistent climb. Not much reinvention there. A little waiver in the 1970-80 range that may just be a matter of what they had for stock that year. Microwaves just stay around $300 the whole way through. Just for a more neutral comparison, though, I also tracked a full size mattress, a dresser, a plain wood chair, a 9 by 12 rug, and a set of sheets, just in case the technology thing was playing a role. They did not have any of the ups and downs with new tech, but they had an upswing that started around 1970, same as our other indicators of inflation, which would make them pretty inconsequential if Not for the fact that nearly all of them went through a huge drop in quality around the same time they started getting more expensive. Sheets went from being cotton to polyblend or all polyester around 1970. Rugs stopped being wool and started using nylon and rayon around 1970. The dressers moved from solid hardwood to pine or veneer, also around 1970. The wood chair didn't change as far as I could tell, though there were fewer and fewer options for them. And the mattress did have a change to coil springs in 1930 over entirely tufted layers of wool or felt cloth, which probably jumped the price a bit, but just switched to all synthetic fabrics and padding around 1970. The price did not lower or even stay the same when most of these shifts happened. They kept going up in price as if the quality and cost of materials had not changed for the manufacturer. What all of that mess tells us is that there isn't a set rise and fall for any type of household good. Some new technology starts off incredibly expensive, gets cheaper, and then begins to rise with inflation after that. Others barely cause a blip of cost difference at their release. Obviously, most of it comes down to competition and just how much extra it costs to fully switch things like new records or even adding running water to a house, which does point to the fact that it's as much about what the customer is willing or able to pay. They kept prices the same while reducing cost of materials when it came to textiles and furniture because it wasn't likely to impact sales. As long as things were trendy styles or advertised as being a positive thing, polyester sheets being satin weave and super shiny like silk, but at a cotton price, despite making anyone sweat sticky buckets at night. But if they say that, the customer won't protest. New technology prices are more about what the customer is willing to pay on an item that isn't an every year purchase, and the barrier to entry issue, which is all very different from how that CPI inflation tracks. Some blips happen in food and fuel costs because of things like World War II and supplies. Others happen because they can, like eggs in 2025. Notice how chicken did not raise up despite eggs being blamed on bird flu? Yes, I know they're different breeds, but meat chickens weren't any more immune to it. It's impossible to make a single calculator that accounts for all of that. Some of our food and fuel costs have gone up faster than our median income. Obviously, the stagnant minimum wage is being fast outpaced as relevant at all. Buying a house is as difficult financially as it was at the very worst point in the entire 20th century, which was really like a month long because it was more often in the 12 to 16% interest range around that time. Rent is not even close to comparable in how bad it is. Our entire budget has shifted to accommodate how much more expensive housing has become. Food may be a little cheaper on average due to being able to import from around the globe, but it's really the rest of our budget that has taken on the hit. Between taxes growing from the 2 to 6% range for median income to 22% today, only really starting that climb in the 1960s, to added insurance and bills like internet, there's just less of the budget to begin with. Granted, our items are cheaper by comparison only because they do like 15 things or they're made entirely out of plastic, or because new styles came out that rendered the old ones extremely cheap because they aren't as desirable. Top load, old style washing machines, and top freezer fridges are the perfect examples of this. They still exist, but are kept around for budget purposes more than anything else. Instead of our strained budgets being the fault of stuff like smartphones, it's honestly completely saved by them. If we still had to purchase all of those things from that 1970 or 1980 list, there'd be no hope. Even excluding the entertainment items like music, and games. It's still expensive, which, let's be honest, betterment and entertainment are on all of the budgets through the last century for a reason. We aren't able to survive without some sort of form of joy and things like music. We know people without that kind of get depressed and other problems start happening with their health and their job. Stuff, So, yeah, it does kind of make sense to have some money to spend on enjoyment, entertainment. Manufacturers, though, would either have to drop their prices way down or we'd all be on technology purchased in 1980 still to this day because we couldn't afford to keep buying new versions of all of those things all of the time. It's a bigger picture issue. Maybe cars haven't changed that much if you compare them to income. But if other things are taking bigger pieces of the pie chart, it becomes a strain. And every industry seems to be operating independent of that idea, like they are only concerned with their prices relative to themselves. The 1970 hike is a great example of that. It wasn't all new tech or all inflation. I mean, jeans jumped from $5 in 1970 to $16 in 1980, not because of inflation, but because they moved out of workwear into fashion. Color TV only raised the price from $200 to $300 when it appeared because they wouldn't be able to sell it by tripling the price like jeans later did. Which, yes, that's the basic of economics when it comes to businesses, but we don't tend to look at how that holistically affects the consumer and their overall budget. Sure, our grocery and fuel costs have gone up a little faster than our income, but what about all the other things? It adds up. And there isn't one industry or company to directly blame for all of it. Going back to that recommended modern budget and applying it to today's median household income. Again, so more than one person, because an individual median income is 45,000, not 81,000. This is what we have. Looking at what the median cost for a couple without kids ends up being, that housing amount recommended is median rent. Almost exactly. So, no room to save for a down payment on a house out of that section. If you already have a house, the median mortgage is 2,000. On health insurance, it's currently $115 for an individual with a job that subsidizes it, 500 for a family who also has a job that helps, and $750 for a family without that help a month. Car insurance is another $100, times that by two if we're talking about a couple. Renter's insurance is around $20. If you have a house, it's more like $200. For a couple, right now, it's around $800 median for groceries a month and other food. Best case, that all adds up to just under 2,400 a month left for fuel, gas to heat your home, electricity to power your home, other bills, maybe property taxes or HOAs, household goods like toilet paper and detergent, toiletries, soap's kind of useful, and clothing because things do eventually wear out. Worst case, that's closer to $1,100 left to manage that. And that's without kids, or pets, or emergencies, or student loan debt, or credit card debt, or anything else like car payments. The cost of what's in the Sears catalog at this point isn't even really the problem. So, all those times people point out how expensive something in the past would be in today's money, no, that's a bunch of useless nonsense. The cost of so many things has gotten worse, leaving us in a position that it doesn't even matter what a TV costs or a pair of jeans. And yes, your situation might be completely different. Your location might be far cheaper or far more expensive. Your life might be far more stable or less stable. I'm just sticking to the math that the government has done for over a century, and that looks tough. The median looks tough, if not impossible. And so obviously, things haven't gotten better. They haven't entirely gotten worse, though. We just need to try to update and fix our system for what it is today by looking at all of the different parts, not just the price of eggs. I mean, yes, legislature and punishment for price gouging is like bare minimum here, but that won't fix taxes, insurance, school debts, or even housing costs. I really need to look into the history of all of those protests and efforts in the 1920s and 30s that got us most of our current labor laws today. Like, minimum wage. Bet we could all learn something there. Also, guess what? You just made it through a very extensive and long economics lesson. Hooray for learning way more than they usually teach us in school, and really should be teaching us. Now, that being said, I understand I'm not an economics professor. I did take economics as part of my graduate school experience. I took multiple classes. I am also very interested in numbers and charts and graphs. And I really, really like laying out all that information and pulling in, creating medians, doing all the equations, gathering all the information. This is just really my special interest right now is economics. So I don't know, by the time I'm done with whatever bend I'm on, I don't know, we'll see how long this lasts. I'm probably going to be a historian in economics. I do feel like those exist out there, but the books that I have read, and not all, definitely not all, but in many cases, are economics for economics people who are focused on the traditional economics. They are looking at national debt or national output. They aren't looking at things like what budgets were recommended in 1930 to a household in order to manage to get by and save a little for the future. They aren't looking at how much a microwave or a banana cost. They're looking at big, overarching, sweeping numbers to understand were people doing well or not? How much money are they spending? Are they going on vacation? Are they getting out there and buying cars? I don't know about you, but I don't feel like that really encompasses the current experience of so many people, especially younger generations who are not able to purchase those things that really define that age, that really define being adult, that really define macroeconomics. They're struggling just to find a job so they can contribute into that macroeconomics. People that do household labor or people that don't earn a taxable wage in certain ways are not actually counted in that. Kind of messes with things a bit. It's all very complicated. We're all working to understand it together. If you have a lot of experience in this, I would love to hear more of what the economics range is thinking about things right now. Are people starting to actually come to their senses and realize that the old way of doing large scale macroeconomics might not be effective with the current models? I'm really curious because, at least when I was studying stuff 10 years ago, there was already murmurs of, yeah, the way that we teach this and the way that economics is approached might not effectively go forward in the future. And so I'm curious if that's already started to change. But for right now, at least, you guys get to join me on this journey where I keep adding more questions than answers because now I want to look up things to do with minimum wage. I want to look up things like labor laws and the history of how we got those. I want to look up the history of taxes. Do you know how big of a thing that's going to be? I think I'm going to have to aim for tax season next year on that one because that's going to be a hefty one. This one was only possible because I already done a lot of the gathering of this information. So I just had to go through tons and tons and tons of old books on Google Books to try and look at little numbers sideways most of the time in order to make this work. It's increasingly crazy to me how simplified things are for presentation on the internet and how we just accept that. That calculator is one of my least favorite things as a historian and has been long before I started economics because we used to have to explain to people all the time at Colonial Williamsburg, no, that's not something we can just do with 18th century money because The way people earned and the way people spent, completely different. No one had cars. No one had electricity. No one had cell phones. No one had insurance in the same way, unless you were a wealthy business owner. That's a whole different thing. Like, if you were putting a ship across the Atlantic Ocean, yeah, you had insurance on that. But not the regular person walking down the street on their car and their home and other stuff. So our finances have completely changed. And we keep forgetting that. So again, yes, maybe bananas are cheaper now, maybe they're more expensive. It doesn't matter if we only have half as much money as they had 100 years ago to buy the banana. If it's the same general price to our income, that's where we gotta start. Where is the money going? What are the budgets? So many budgets. If you guys have extensive questions about where I got this information from, if you've managed to make it this long, if you want more graphs, more info, more charts, um, join my Patreon and I am happy to answer those questions and put more things up there. I just don't want to clutter this space up a ton, but I'm always happy to share my sources, as erratic as they may seem from the outside. That's also why I'm not putting them here. It seems like I'm just all over the place, but I promise there's a rhyme, a reason, and a lot of hours of research in every single one of these, because I don't like the idea of just making up numbers. And on that matter, one of the other things that came out of this video was me wondering about the quality of goods being produced. So I've also gotten a lot of questions about that. So starting next week, you guys get to experience, preview for those that are stuck around, the Everything Sucks series, or the Why Everything Sucks Now series. We're starting with fabric, because I think it's important for us all to learn how fabric is produced, where all the shortcuts are, how we keep messing this up. Like, not as consumers. We're not taught this. So I'm teaching. Teaching so we can all make better life choices, better purchasing choices, and hopefully through that, try to at least force a little bit of progress. Or, if nothing else, prevent people watching from buying clothing that's going to be full of holes after one wash. So that'll be the first in many. Keep an eye out for that very soon if you want to see more on it sooner. Again, Patreon, always up early there.